Well, I'm Randy May, president of the Free State Foundation, and I want to welcome you here, of course. I have to say, for such a complex, if not arcane topic as the one we're discussing today, it's great, particularly early in the morning, to see such a terrific crowd here. I recognize a lot of you, of course, but others I don't, and I'm afraid, or at least wondering whether some of you might have seen the billboard down at the bottom or out on the street that said USF and thought that it stood for unusual sexual fantasies or something like that. But that's not the case. But we have you here now, which is good. So the title of our program today pretty much sums up what we're about: reforming universal service, what should be done, and how much to do it. And because the FCC is actually in the process of receiving comments and considering changes to the USF program and acting shortly, hopefully, this seminar is particularly timely. I don't want to steal the thunder from Commissioner Tate or from our distinguished panel, whom I will introduce in a few moments. I know they will cover the full range of the issues before us before we're done today. So I'm just going to set the stage very briefly with this background. One way to set the stage is to observe that to support the various USF programs, consumers today pay an 11% fee on their interstate calls. It was about 7% in 2001. Now wake up everybody, okay, wake up. Because the name of today's program is not actually reforming universal service, what should be done and how to do it, although it well could have been in part. Rather, it is universal service and intercarrier compensation. Will the FCC finally bite the reform bullet? That's the name of today's program. And the USF contribution factor today is not the 11% I just mentioned, but close to 15%, right? What I recited just a few moments ago is verbatim from an introduction to a Free State Foundation program held on April 28, 2008, when it looked like the FCC was on the verge of tackling USF and intercarrier compensation reform. Well, we'll get to that, but I won't. But you can check the transcript. That was actually verbatim. Now, and I mentioned Commissioner Tate. I singled her out just now because in my remarks I done it because she gave actually some fine introductory remarks at the 2008 program about how she was hopeful then that the FCC was on the cusp of acting. So that was April 2008. This is July 2011. But it's still accurate to say now, as I did then, quote, you can check the transcript, because the FCC is actually in the process of receiving comments and considering various changes to the USF program and enacting shortly, this seminar is particularly timely. Now, while that program then was focused more on the USF side than intercarrier compensation, because they are inextricably linked, today's seminar is explicitly focused on both. For context, I just want to read a couple of excerpts from two different commission decisions. These are from 2001, expressing a sense of urgency regarding the agency's need to comprehensively reform the intercarrier compensation regime. Quote, this is quote, "We believe it essential to reevaluate these existing intercarrier compensation regimes in light of increasing competition in new technologies, such as the internet and internet-based services and commercial mobile radio services. We are particularly interested in identifying a unified approach to intercarrier compensation, one that would apply to interconnection arrangements between all types of carriers interconnecting with the local telephone network and all types of traffic passing over the local telephone network. The existing intercarrier compensation rules raise several pressing issues First, and probably most important, are the opportunities for regulatory arbitrage created by the existing patchwork of intercarrier compensation rules. Okay, well, that was 2001. So here's what the FCC said this spring in launching its current reform effort. Quote, "We face these problems because our universal service rules and intercarrier compensation system designed for 20th century networks and market dynamics have not been comprehensively reassessed in more than a decade, even though the communications landscape has changed dramatically." Now, we all know, or I think most of you know, except those of you who wandered in expecting us to be talking about unusual sexual fantasies, you know that what these issues are. So I'm not gonna really steal any thunder from today's panel or try and outline them in any depth. I think at the macro level, without getting into any of the any other levels, let me just throw out a few macro sort of headlines. Should the proposed Connect America fund be capped? Should other funds be capped? At what levels? How should the subsidy distributions be prioritized? Should reverse auctions be used to distribute subsidies? Should lifeline subsidies support broadband? Should subsidies support broadband adoption programs? Who should contribute to the subsidy funds? Of course, those are just a few of them, the high-level issues. Now, you know, you might not believe this from watching the news over the last week or two, but I think there are a lot of people that would probably subscribe to the view that resolving or acting on these USF ICC issues is more difficult than solving the debt ceiling issue, but maybe in our world just as important. But I'm hopeful that progress is going to be made in my view, in a market-oriented way, and one that promotes competition and also promotes consumer welfare. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. I'm going to introduce them actually in the order that I'd like for them to speak, so they can pay attention to this order. And I'm going to ask them to speak initially for about 7 or 8 minutes, and then that will give us plenty of time for them to interact with each other, which I'd like for them to do as they listen to their fellow panelists, and also for questions from the audience. So as you're listening to the panelists, please be thinking about whether you have questions for the panelists. Now, every one of you should have hopefully picked up a sheet with the biographies of the speakers when you came in. If not, they're on our Free State Foundation website, or they're probably still some outside. So I'm going to dispense with telling you where they went to school and their entire job history, and just give you a couple of quick highlights for each speaker. And they're so distinguished that actually I know most of you know them. You probably know their bios. First off, we're going to hear from James Assey. James began his tenure as Executive Vice President for the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA. It's going to be important to keep NCTA and NTCA straight here this morning. James began his tenure with NCTA as Executive Vice President on February 1, 2008. And as NCTA's second most senior executive, he's involved in all aspects of NCTA's work on behalf of the cable industry. And before joining NCTA, he was a longtime senior staff member on the Commerce Committee in the U.S. Senate. And I'll just add with James, he was during the interregnum over at the Cable Association between Kyle McSlero and Michael Powell, the new chair, James was the CEO over there, the acting CEO, and the association didn't miss a beat, of course. Okay, so next up will be Mike Romano, and Mike is Senior Vice President at NTCA, the National Telecommunications Cooperative Association. He's been in that position since August 2010, and in that capacity, Mike oversees the association's recently merged government affairs and legal and industry divisions with a particular focus on regulatory and industry efforts. And I would just add with respect to Mike that he, you know, from my reading of the trade press, he seems to be right at the heart of the public policy efforts for his association and other rural interests that are taking place in the current cycle. So next up, we're going to hear from Tom Tauke. As all of you know, Tom is Executive Vice President at Verizon. His full title is Executive Vice President, Public Affairs, Policy, and Communications. He's been in that position since May 2004, where he oversees media relations, employee communications, reputation management, philanthropy, corporate responsibility, and external relations. Tom, what's left for Ivan Seidenberg to do over there at Verizon? That's a full portfolio. So Tom is obviously the company's senior policy executive and responsible for development of Verizon's public policy positions. Next, we're going to hear from Jerry Ellig. And Jerry is senior. God, I think I've used senior so far in every single one of these bios. Jerry Ellig is Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where Jerry has worked since 1996, but between August 2001 and August 2003, Dr. Ellig. So I'm not doing degrees, but that gave Jerry's a PhD, served as Deputy Director and Acting Director of the Office of Policy and Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. Now remember that 2008 program I mentioned? Was anyone there? Or you probably wouldn't remember, that's been a long time ago. But Jerry was on that program, and he might not have remembered until I told him, but he gave, as part of the dialogue after the introductory remarks, Jerry actually sang When the Money Comes Rolling In from Evita. I think he was making a point, but I'm going to force him to do an encore of that sometime. So you're on notice, if you still think it's relevant. Now, so last but not least, of course, we've got Deborah Taylor Tate. As you know, Debbie's a former commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. She is now, which in my book is equally as prestigious and as important, she's Distinguished Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Free State Foundation, and we... No, you didn't. But had you would have sailed through. And we're really pleased with all of her contributions. And so now, for present purposes, I'm just going to mention that probably significantly for our purposes here today, Debbie served as chair of both the Federal State Joint Board on Universal Service and the Federal State Joint Board on Jurisdictional Separations. Anybody know what, jurisdictional separations? That's the docket the commission opened in 1980. It still has a docket number 80-286, which indicates that it was opened in 1980. I wish they'd changed the docket number and throw us off, but anyway, That's still going on for those of you interested in that. Now, so, by the way, you know, Debbie's probably going to say more of this, but I'll say it too. She's, in addition to, you know, this stuff like the USF and intercarrier compensation reform, as important as those things are, she, you know, has passion for certain other issues. One of which is the relationship of children in today's media and how the whether help children relate to the media, and she's done a number of things in that area, as you know, but most recently she's teamed up with Gina Davis for this new effort called Healthy Media, which is important. And she sent me some nice pictures of she and Gina Davis on that effort. So, and I think the Cable Association actually plays a big role in that. So all that said, by way of introduction, we're going to move in now to the program. And again, I'm going to ask our speakers if they could just limit their remarks probably to 7 or 8 minutes initially, and then we'll have some good back and forth. James?
Sure. Thank you, Randy. Do I need to lean in here? Yeah. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm always amazed whenever we have panels on universal service reform that anyone actually shows up. So maybe a mistake is, or just the fact that we had coffee was a big draw. But I am glad to be here because I do think we sit at an inflection point of sorts with respect to universal service, and it's important that we give this issue its due and that we discuss what the future is going to look like. Oftentimes as we sit on these panels talking about universal service reform, we kind of, you know, the pendulum swings back and forth from, you know, the time is now to the end is near. And maybe I'll start somewhere in the middle, which is, you know, if not now, when? Because I think, as all of us in this room know, this has been one of the most intractable problems. It's been essentially Exhibit A as a government program in need of reform for at least, you know, the last 20 years. And it's a problem. The current mechanism that we have is not adapted to the modern telecommunications marketplace that we live in. It places a growing burden on consumers, as Randy's adverted to the fact that the contribution factor has, you know, tripled since basically the last decade. And we increasingly have a program that is designed not to respect fair competition in the marketplace, where people are providing broadband service and voice service without subsidy. So I think there's no question that if you had a vote on whether or not the universal service program needs to change, you'd be well north of probably 85%. The question is, how do we get from A to B? And there's some very big questions that we ought to spend some serious time talking about. But I think we shouldn't let, you know, as one lobbyist once told me when I dealt with this issue many moons ago, and I said, you know, universal service is just so easy to get pulled down into the weeds. And they turned to me and they said, yeah, and even the weeds have weeds. You know, it's true. We can wrap ourselves up in acronyms until we are, you know, asphyxiated. But what's more important, I think, and actually I should give kudos to the Commission and the broadband plan for really trying to go back to first principles and to ask us as a nation, what is it that we want this system to accomplish? And I think there was a important recognition that the system that we grew up with in universal service is not reflective of the modern marketplace we live in. You know, we had in the 20th century a single provider, incumbent telephone company that provided a single service which was local exchange service, over a single technology, which was essentially a twisted copper pair. Today we have ILEX, CLEX, cable, wireless, satellite providers. We have multiple services with which to recover costs, voice, video, internet, and we have multiple technology platforms that will enable us to give consumers the access that reaches the spirit of universal service. So we have to adapt the system that we have to meet the challenges and to respect the benefits of competition that we see in the marketplace essentially on a daily basis. So I'm going to try to not tie myself up in Gordian knots here of epic proportions, because I feel like the debate has really almost always led us to that, but to really go back and to think about 4 elements of reform that I think will be informative if we are to move forward in achieving a sustainable universal service policy. And the first, and I think actually one of the more important things that we ought to consider as we move forward, is really getting a control on the size of the high-cost fund. I think one of the ways that we can prove we're serious about reform, about reestablishing priorities within the fund, is by capping USF support, so that we can essentially put a tourniquet on what we see as rampant growth in the program. Secondly, I think we need to recognize that with respect to voice service, we have done a good job that has largely achieved our objective. I think people would be hard-pressed, and I'm sure there are pockets, I'm sure, where people will point to where we still have a little ways to go. But by and large, those people who want voice service today can get voice service. And as a result, the support that we have traditionally, that actually provides us an advantage, because the support that we have dedicated for voice service can now be used for other purposes. We have record subscribership. We, in the cable industry, already provide broadband to 93% of households, pretty much largely without any subsidy. And we see situations where, whether or not you're a rural cable customer or you're in downtown DC, the rates are by and large uniform. The key, and obviously this is an important key, is that we figure out how to phase in the reductions in a responsible way, and that we try to do it in a way that is sensible given the current need for us to achieve reform. The third point that I'd stress is that we need to basically figure out a new broadband support system that targets funds to where we don't have broadband. One of the most difficult problems that we see with the current mechanism is that it essentially rewards companies who are essentially in a competitive environment, and we are essentially thwarting the incentives of folks who are risking private capital in the marketplace to provide service. And you can object to that, I think, on the basis that the government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers, but I think there's an even stronger objection that we ought to think about, which is we're not spending the monies wisely enough. We need to be more efficient in how we target support, and establishing a support mechanism that really focuses on areas where there is either a monopoly or or no provision of service will help us achieve our objectives. And I think in that respects, the other point I would make is that the broadband plan, I think, did a very good job of explaining the task before us. The last 0.2% of the households that we have in the nation are incredibly expensive to reach. And I think we have to recognize that there are alternatives out there that will provide access through satellite broadband and the growth of new technologies that we should not discount, so that we can achieve what is achievable in the near term of extending broadband to the roughly 7 million households that don't have it today. And lastly, and I think as Randy said, we have to get our hands around reforming intercarrier compensation. We have a system today that is what I said, where the weeds have weeds, and they're not rationally related to anything that I think people would point to as being objectively fair. So we have to get our hands around that, and we have to figure out a system, at least in the short term, that will provide an effective mechanism that will compensate for those companies that are not going to be able to recover their costs purely through universal service support mechanisms, but are going to be able to demonstrate real need for additional support in the short term. These are all problems that we're going to face in between points A and point B. But as I said at the start, if not now, when?
James, thank you very much. I don't know whether all of you can hear it. There's a demonstration outside, so I'm going to ask the speakers to make sure they speak up. I think they're demonstrating, from what I can gather, demanding USF reform, but I'm not sure. But so let's make sure you speak up. So next, Mike, you're up next.
Great. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate that chance to be here as well. I listened to James talk about weeds on weeds, and for someone who lives in the weeds far too often, it feels more like they have thorns sometimes. So I was glad to be able to pull myself away to be here. It's a much more pleasant experience than some of the debates. I think one of the things that I appreciated what James had to say about the 4 elements of an approach, but I think sometimes it's also helpful to step back and do a little bit of a fact check about what guides the approach that we need to take to reform. You know, we hear a lot about rampant growth. We hear a lot about waste, fraud, and abuse. When one puts a spotlight on the facts, neither of those is true. First, let's take a look at the success of this program. I understand that there are problems in the program, and I'll talk about a few that actually are driving our members, the rural providers, to seek change as well and to want change this year. But it's a program that, at least as the rural providers, has worked very well. It's a system of which the U.S. government should be proud. You've got a program that, from our own membership straw, has only grown by about 3% per year on average over the last 6 years. And at the same time, you've gotten broadband penetration in these most rural, hard-to-serve areas up from under about 75, 78%, up to over 92, 93%. So when we say that the program isn't working, there are elements of it that are broken, but let's not pretend that the entire system is broken. Let's not fall back into that rhetoric. Let's figure out what is broken within the system and take targeted surgical measures to figure out what to fix within that. An overly visionary and overly experimental view of this, broadband's far too important in rural areas to take those kinds of approaches to it. Instead, let's take a look at the facts and then figure out, based upon those facts, what steps do we need to take to address the problems that are found. The other thing I think that's worth noting here is that we talk about rampant growth in the fund. As I just mentioned, the rural draw on universal service support has been growing at about 3% per year. That's not rampant growth. That's maybe a little bit ahead of inflation right now. It's probably behind inflation, depending on where it goes in the future. But the fact is that there's not rampant growth in the high-cost fund. There may be rampant growth in the universal service fund as a whole, but the high-cost fund is only a portion of that. Then, if you unpack that further, within the high-cost fund, the growth has not come from rural carriers' draws on universal service. It has come, by and large, from growth in identical support and from growth in Lifeline and LinkUp. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of what problems do I need to solve, let's start there. Let's figure out how to address those issues, and then working backward from that, we can come up with common sense solutions for what reform should look like. So then you get into, well, how do we do this? What are the approaches? And James mentioned several, and I think we do have some agreement on some of those. In terms of controlling the size of the fund, I guess to some degree, if you look at it from the perspective of what's going on in the high-cost fund, it's a solution in search of a problem. We also run into the issue of how do you predict what the cap should look like? Why is the 2010 funding level, for example, for universal service the right answer? Who determined that that's sufficient, predictable, and specific support under the statute? We have a statute that's a backdrop here. We could come up with what we think is the most desirable policy in the world, but at the end of the day, we have to look back to a statute that tells us what we need to do. And a cap, unless someone comes up with an evidentiary basis for it, isn't going to be specific, predictable, or sufficient. That being said, the Commission can take steps to constrain growth in the fund and should do that. We think there are ways that the Commission can do this to make sure that it addresses something called, for example, the race to the top. The race to the top is a dynamic whereby carriers may be encouraged to invest in networks aggressively. It doesn't always happen, but it may have that incentive in the system. The Commission should take a step to address that. It actually hurts our members because they start to lose support as others invest over them. This is something that would help to constrain growth in the fund and solve what's one of the biggest problems out there. So we look at it and say, let's be targeted. Let's not engage in predictive judgments. Let's not pretend we know what the world's going to look like 10 or 15 years from now and define an end game and pretend that that's going to be right. When the Commission issued that 2001 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Intercarrier compensation reform, the word broadband was mentioned once substantively in passing. We didn't know 10 years ago what intercarrier compensation reform needs might be. We didn't know what factors might drive it. To pretend that we're going to know what it's going to look like in 10 or 15 years from now is both overly ambitious and dangerous. So, another point that James mentioned is phasing in the reforms in a responsible way. Couldn't agree more. Again, harkening back to doing it surgically, and then also making sure that we've got these reforms in place that are not death spirals or flash cuts, but are more along the lines of sensible transitions to put us on the path to a desired end game, but not to flash cut to that end game. At the end of the day, I think the legacy that the Commission should be looking for in terms of a reform package here is sustainability. Everybody talks about, let's try to get broadband into unserved areas. It will do no one any good in a 21st century economy to get broadband to an unserved area if there's nothing to help it stay there. If there's no business plan to keep it there, it will simply die off over time under its own weight. We have to look at this as a two-pronged approach. We have to be looking at how to get broadband where it's needed, and we have to be looking at how to keep broadband where a market won't support it on its own. So with that, I'll stop there, and we can come back to some of those points during the questions. But thank you, Randy.
Good. Thank you, Mike. I know one thing that Mike said that I made a note of. He said the high-cost fund cap is, quote, a solution in search of a problem. I think that was right. So we'll see whether Tom Tauke and others agree with that as we keep sharpening the focus here back and forth. Tom?
Good morning. Thank you, Randy, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I'm going to be somewhat less diplomatic. I guess that comes with old age. You can be blunter in your assessment of what's going on. If I had been here a dozen years ago, representing, at that time, Bell Atlantic, I would have considered this a really vital issue for our company because we were going through a very tough transition from a legacy voice business to a new world. Over the last dozen years, we've made that transition. So we've invested heavily in wireless, which is now the growth engine of the company. We've invested in video, which is the growth engine on the wireline side of the business. We've divested a lot of rural lines and transferred those to other companies. And so as a result, we have largely made the transition. We don't have a whole lot of revenue at stake anymore in the access business, and we've never relied much on universal service support. So this no longer, frankly, is a big deal for Verizon. But it is a big deal for the industry. And since we're part of the industry, it's a significant thing for us, and that's why it's still an important issue. But in terms of our company standing alone, or AT&T, if I could speak for Bob here, we've been through the transition. But now the transition is hitting other companies, those in serving less urban parts of the country. And they do not have, many of them, the advantage of also being in the wireless business. Some of them have not gone into the video business. they are still largely voice and broadband companies. And this transition is very tough for them. Let's look at what's happening to the three legs of the financial stool for these companies. Some are mid-sized, some are small. They essentially have three major sources of revenue. What they charge their consumers, first. Second, what they get from access charges that other carriers pay them. And third, universal service support. Let me address the second leg of that stool, access charges, which for some of these companies is in excess of a third of their revenue. From 2006 to 2007, the decline in access minutes was 8%. From 2007 to 2008, the decline in access minutes was 9.4%. From 2008 to 2009, the decline in minutes was 11.9%, and from 2009 to 2010, the decline in minutes was 13.8%. Do you sense a pattern here? The access minutes are essentially going away. For many of the companies who are not rate of return companies, the revenue is going away. Now, for some of the rate of return companies, they are maintaining their revenue. How do they do that? They raise the access rates. So the average NECA switched access minute has almost doubled between 2006 and 2011. So in 2006, it was 1.9 cents per minute. Now it's at 3.6 cents per minute. This year, NECA's average rate is going up 17.8% per minute in 1 year, 17.8%. So what do we have? Minutes are down. For some companies, rates are up. And third, technology is there to allow bypass. This is not a good scenario for those who are trying to make the transition. So when I look at this issue now, 10 years later or 11 years later from where I started, how do I look at this issue? First, we're trying to figure out a way to manage the transition to the broadband world for those who have not yet made that transition, fully made that transition. And we're trying to do it in a way that provides stability to those carriers who have relied on the access support and universal support system. This is all about trying to preserve the stability of those entities. Now, frankly, I'll just say as an aside, it's pretty astonishing sometimes that the ones who want to change least are those who need it the most. But in any event, we have to provide stability for those companies because all of us need those wireline carriers, whether we love them or not, and I love them, but we need them to be stable and to be able to grow and prosper. Otherwise, we have significant problems in our communications infrastructure in the country. So the first objective is to manage this transition in a way which allows those carriers to maintain financial stability. The second objective is to support broadband deployment rather than hold down voice rates. You know, the whole system in the past was focused on holding down the amount you pay for voice. You know, we don't need to do that anymore. People can sign up for, Magic Jack or Skype or a variety of other things and get really cheap voice service. They can get really cheap voice service via wireless. I mean, there are lots of alternatives. Holding down voice rates is not a national priority anymore. The priority is to get deployment of broadband to everybody in the country so they can be part of the new world of communications. So those are the two objectives, stability of the remaining companies and deployment of broadband. As you know, there has been a lot of effort made to try to develop some kind of industry position, consensus, whatever, and that work is ongoing. I think there is a strong hope and anticipation that within the next couple of weeks a proposal will be filed with the FCC. Sure won't have support from everybody in the industry is my guess, but it'll be a solid effort to try to address these two major issues and to do it in a way that is responsible. So the first part of that plan, or at least the first part in my mind, is that we move to a very low intercarrier compensation rate moving to drop top that 0007 compensation rate for the exchange of traffic at the end of a 5-year period. We have immediate FCC action on a number of other things relating to VoIP compensation, traffic pumping, phantom traffic, and the like. We also provide, because that is obviously a significant potential hit to one leg of the stool for some of the carriers, we provide a mechanism to replace some of that access revenue with universal service support. The second big piece of it is to move from the voice subsidy to promoting the deployment of broadband. And so as a result, the money flows to the areas where broadband has not been deployed. We have done the mapping of the nation. We know where the targets are, and we focus the dollars on getting the money to the places where broadband has not yet deployed in order to give additional incentive for that deployment. That is the essence of the plan. There are a lot of other details which people may want to ask about and which I may or may not want to disclose at this juncture. But in any event, bottom line is the effort is underway to try to get something done. And I would just close with, I think, the same message the first two speakers have had in slightly different forms. This is the time for dealing with this issue. It isn't going to get better if we put it off. It may be, however, that it will be less meaningful to many players in the system the longer we put it off, and we'll have to do more dramatic things to save the infrastructure in some parts of the country.
Tom, thank you very much. And, you know, if you'll allow me to say this with due respect to every one of our other speakers and all other speakers everywhere, I would say I'm really pleased that Tom is here, because I think you can, that he came today, because I think you can tell with his long experience in the industry and the expertise he's developed, and also I think the vision that he has and his goodwill, that if there's going to be a solution to this thing in the near term that will move forward, I'm sure that Tom will be instrumental in that. So I appreciate especially your being here. Jerry, you're up next, and do not sing those bars from Evita now. That's later.
Darn. Okay, well, I remember, heck, Randy, it might have been at the event several years ago, or it might have been someplace else, where somebody led off a talk on universal service by saying, well, you know, pretty much everything that could be said about universal service has been said, but not everybody's had a chance to say it yet. And that's why we still have conferences and panels. And so I was trying to figure out, I was beating myself up yesterday trying to figure out, is there anything I could conceivably talk about that hasn't been brought up at some point and wouldn't likely be brought up by somebody on the panel? And I finally realized, after doing that yesterday, I realized this morning what it is. I want to talk about something that I don't think I've ever heard this very explicitly discussed in universal service debates, which is greed. And I'm going to say something that you're going to be surprised to hear from an economist. Greed is bad. Okay, now, anybody from the media, there's your man bites, dog bites sound bite. Economist says greed is bad. How could this possibly be? Because we all, quote, know that Adam Smith said greed is good. Well, actually, he never used those words. And if you actually go back and read The Wealth of Nations, you find that what Adam Smith said is, under a particular set of rules of the game, which he referred to as the system of natural liberty, people's propensity to want to better themselves can be turned into a propensity to also do things that are in the general public interest. So even if you want to characterize that as saying greed is good, Adam Smith was not saying that greed is good in all circumstances. It is only good under a certain set of rules of the game, under a certain set of political principles. When subsidies are on the table, greed is bad. Let me give you 3 examples of that from universal service. I don't have quite the history. I'm sorry. I missed the grand opening of docket 8286. I didn't get involved in this till, you know, only in time for the grand reopening. But in any case, yeah, I haven't been doing this as long as some people. I mean, there's people like Bob Crandall at the Brookings Institution who's been, you know, studying universal service since I was in diapers, almost, you know, literally. So I can't claim to have quite the perspective that a lot of folks have. But I can give 3 examples of this kind of thing. One was on phone service. You know, let me do one other thing. Let me define what I would say is greed in the universal service context. It's going beyond what's basic or essential for whatever reasons, whether it's self-interest, whether it's ideological reasons, whether it's somebody's political philosophy. Greed in the universal service context is going beyond what's basic or essential. And I think probably, you know, with a good enough lawyer, you could find that's what the Telecom Act says as well, but I'm not going to go down that road. But 3 examples. One is on voice service. You know, somehow the Telecom Act and the FCC regulations implementing it, you know, started with a very sound idea, which is that technology has changed, and that means that in some areas that traditionally had to be subsidized monopolies, competition may be possible now because we have lower cost technologies. And in other places where traditionally we had only one firm, maybe the market can still only support one carrier, but there might be a way to do it at lower costs. And so somehow we need to have some form of competition to figure out can the incumbent still do it at lowest cost, or can somebody new do it at lowest cost? But we went from that sensible proposition to a system in which somehow folks in rural areas virtually got guaranteed the right to both a basic landline and mobile service. And this is not necessarily the FCC's fault, because I know if I recall correctly, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but if I recall correctly, there were cases where the FCC or the Joint Board on Universal Service said, you know, maybe we should tell people not to be so greedy and say, we're going to limit this to 1 line per household. And whenever that was even suggested, you know, certain members of Congress would go ballistic. So I'm not just blaming the FCC here. But somehow we went from the idea that somehow we ought to have some kind of competition to figure out how to do this at the lowest cost to, you know, kind of a non sequitur that, well, now everybody's got a right to a subsidized mobile telephone line as well. And so there's something that's just not right there. Second example, more recent, I think, is the National Broadband Plan's definition of broadband as 4 megabyte download, 1 megabyte upload. I think this far overreaches what's in the Telecom Act, and Jerry Brito and I filed comments on this. But let me suggest a few things about this that folks may not have realized or thought of when you've heard this figure quoted. If 4 megabytes download, 1 megabyte upload is the goal, the broadband plan calculates that about 7 million households, or about 5% of the population, don't have access to broadband. This calculation ignores the availability of satellite. So satellite doesn't count as broadband for the purpose of figuring out that 7 million households don't have access. The 4 megabyte download, 1 megabyte upload pretty much rules out 3rd generation wireless from counting as broadband. So folks who have access to broadband through 3G wireless but not wireline are counted as not having access to broadband. Now, you could have a debate over what the appropriate speed is. My only point is that this particular definition does some things that substantially increase the cost of the estimated cost of bringing broadband to rural areas by saying it must be 4 megabyte download, 1 megabyte upload. I was at a session a couple of weeks ago where Billy Jack Gregg, the longtime consumer advocate from West Virginia, said, heck, I've been to places where 768 kilobytes would be like dying and going to heaven to the folks who live there. So, you know, it's maybe overreaching a little bit. It raises the cost of the subsidies, and it also inflates the percentage of the population that is perceived as not having access to broadband. I took a look at some FCC statistics this past spring that suggests that about 1% of the population lacks access to broadband that's at least 3 megabytes download, 200 kilobytes upload. So if you use that as your definition, the size of the problem falls to 1/5 the size calculated in the National Broadband Plan. Again, these are all kind of round numbers. I took a shot at estimating. If you assume that about 1% of the population still needs subsidized broadband, and you assume that those households ought to pay about the average that people pay for broadband, and the subsidy could chip in the rest, it would cost around $635 million a year to just buy them all satellite subscriptions. That's a lot smaller than the figure in the National Broadband Plan. I'm not saying that's necessarily the right figure. I'm just talking that out to be a little provocative and get folks thinking that perhaps 4 megabytes download, 1 megabyte upload is a tad greedy. The third manifestation of this is not a particular policy, but it was the longtime refusal until the past few years of regulators and some who comment in the regulatory process, longtime refusal to actually measure and assess what the program has accomplished. Government Accountability Office came out with a report several years ago that said, you know, 10 years after the FCC created the high-cost program, the FCC still doesn't have performance measures for it. Now, to its credit, the FCC initiated a rulemaking on performance measures, asked about performance measurement in the current NPRM. So I think there's, you know, a lot of progress there. Again, I'm not just trying to beat up the FCC, but I think it's interesting that even a couple of years ago, in the FCC proceeding on performance measurement for universal service, there were some commenters arguing that the FCC does not need to know what the program accomplished. There were even some, being in an educational institution, I was really ashamed to see this. There were even some representatives of the educational community who said, and I realize this is about the high-cost program, but there were some representatives of the educational community who argued in comments to the FCC that the FCC does not need to know whether the schools and libraries program has done anything to improve the quality of education. If folks argue this with a straight face, that is just amazing to me. And I was going to say, I was ashamed to read other folks who consider themselves educators saying that we should make policy based on ignorance of what the actual effects of the policy are.
And by the way, this is not only about the high cost fund, although that's a big issue. So feel free to, any of you, talk about any parts of the USF program. Go ahead, excuse me.
Oh, okay, cool, no problem then. So I'm glad to see that the FCC is trying to remedy this. At this point on the issue of doing retrospective evaluation of these programs, what we need to look out for is that we measure the results of the programs by comparing what happens to a counterfactual of what would have happened in the absence of the program, not just say, well, broadband subscribership's going up, so we must be doing a great job. I mean, you know, maybe it would have gone up, you know, by any amount, for any reason, you know, for some other reason anyway. This isn't necessarily easy. You know, it's what people who are trained in analysis do all the time. But that's the kind of thing I think we need to watch out for in the performance measurement component of the reforms. So will the FCC bite the reform bullet? I think whether the FCC will and the nature of the reforms adopted are going to depend on whether the Commission is going to take a strong stand for or against greed.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. And then finally, to wrap up the initial presentations, we have Debbie Tate. Now, remember, as you know, she's a former FCC Commissioner and head of the Joint Board and FFSF Senior Fellow. I have this, you know, sort of thing in my mind, this dream that maybe at this program here, there's going to be some agreement reached that's free market oriented, economically sound, pro-competitive, and then, so Ted, you'll be writing this headline, you know, Free State Foundation Seminar agreement reached, debt ceiling, talks surpassed, you know, I'll knock them off the front page. So with that, Debbie.
Well, while Tom was talking, I was actually thinking maybe we should just lock the doors down and I should get out of the way and we should get Bob up here. And Bob, I want to give you equal time to say that you love Mike's members too. I know. So I wanted to make sure we got that on the record. But seriously, I mean, hearing Tom talk about this, and I think there is something to be said for once you've dealt with these issues for this long. This is an ecosystem, and I felt like I begged, cajoled, not only my fellow commissioners, but most everybody in this room to try to come to an agreement. And it was, it's been interesting to sit here and think about where we were, and I just kind of had some of my notes that I thought you all would just find very interesting, that when we were 4 of us, our happy bipartisan FCC, and we had actually gotten to some agreements, I thought, at that point, that some of my notes were the commissioners would still be open to total overhauls of ICC and USF in the near term, said Commissioner Copps. So that was huge to me, that I felt like I'd really made some progress.
Wow.
And that Commissioner Copps actually said that he had hoped last year, so this is talking about at that point in time, 2008, I guess, when the joint board had been meeting, to make even more progress than we did. And then I had kind of just made a few notes that we had come to consensus on phantom traffic pumping, the idea of some kind of reverse auction pilot project, and then I make a little note that Commissioner Copps would, of course, want it limited. I'm not quoting him, I'm just saying these are my notes, would want it limited in some way. And that Lifeline and Link Up would be eligibility based, which of course it is, and based on need, and precisely what was the original USF's purpose, that the identical support rule would be eliminated. There would be a CETC cap, so this is before that had even happened, but no overall cap on the fund. I talked some about what Commissioner McDowell would have liked to address regarding audits and safeguards. Much of that has been implemented, as you all know, for the overall USF, and there are much more audits being done now with regard to Lifeline and Link Up, which I think is wonderful that they've moved in that way. That we would move toward a unified rate about intercarrier comps. So, it was pretty interesting to think about that you had a bipartisan group of people who had come to that much agreement. Now, not everybody at this table would have probably been in agreement with that, but we had at least, moved the ball, I thought, pretty far forward. And yet, remarkably, how in the world could it be 2011? And I feel like, wow, we're back even farther than that. I was very interested, and like Randy, I looked at some of what people say. So I always think it's interesting, because I learned that sometimes you learn what a chairman wants to do in a speech or the New York Times or by a statement. And so taking that lesson, I then applied it to the new chairman, where he said, at the same time, USF and ICC are riddled with inefficient, outdated rules and perverse incentives. For example, according to one study, $100 million flow to phone companies each year to serve areas where competing providers without $1 of government support offer voice service to all households. In many places, USF funds 4 or more phone companies. I remember funding 14 to serve the same area. And it leaves hundreds of companies to control their own funding spigot with guaranteed double-digit returns. Does that make sense? Then he gives an example on the ICC side. It can cost 10 times more to call a friend a few towns over than to call someone on the other side of the world. So I think that this chairman was sending out some signals that everybody in this room may want to quote and use, or at least realize that that's kind of where we are. He said that we were wasting taxpayer dollars every year, growing without constraint, and that that's unacceptable. So I think that he has kind of laid down the gauntlet about that. One of the things that you all know is that I started out as a state commissioner, and actually will be joining my colleagues along with some of you all next week in LA. And so one of the things I guess that I wanted to talk just a moment about is Lifeline and LinkUp, because I think it's kind of interesting that as a fiscal conservative and, as you all know, a strong Republican, that, you know, this would be something that is very near and dear to my heart. But I think that when you think about a program like Lifeline LinkUp, it does many of the things that we would hope that a government program might do, and that is that there's really strict eligibility requirements, and that the subsidy actually goes to a consumer, and that the consumer has a choice about what kind of service to select. Hopefully, one day, very soon, that might also be able to do exactly what one of you all was talking about wireless and getting wireless broadband, for instance. So, you know, I'm a big fan of Lifeline and LinkUp. I recognize that it is, in some ways, a way to have a much cheaper and more efficient way to bridge what is becoming the digital divide. The broadband gap between homes with incomes over $100,000 and below $25,000 is about 34 points. The educational gap between college degrees and no high school degree is 29 points. The gap between Caucasians and persons of color is in the double digits. So it's interesting to Jerry's definitions that while we watch democracy growing and tyranny being toppled in many other countries through the use of wireless devices, whether it's Egypt or other countries that have unrest right now, or we see African villages where they're connecting for the first time through wireless devices, or Chinese farmers checking market prices. Our own citizens in some ways can't even take advantage of this unbelievable technology that the world is now competing against us using. You know, try to leave your cell phone at home for a day and see what your life is like. I mean, I accidentally did it one, yeah, because Ivan can't get a hold of him. You know, but right now, this world is so digitally connected, and whether it's e-commerce or e-government, I mean, in many states you can't even get a driver's license without filling out the online application. And as we all know, if your kids are out there looking for jobs like mine are, the only way to get a job now is to apply online. So it's all services. The only way basically that I talk to my doctor right now is online through, you know, health information systems. So there's no doubt. I mean, we all agree. The great news is everybody agrees that the USF fund needs reform, and that every segment of it needs reform. You know, and the other thing that we need to be doing, and certainly Randy touched on this, is that we need to be funding the most efficient technologies that are available. So whether it's wireless or it's prepaid or wireless prepaid broadband, 25% of us now live in a wireless-only world, and that is only growing as our kids move into this world. I mean, all of you all with kids, I mean, who are at least our age, know that they're not connected by a landline anymore. Not that we don't need y'all's landlines. But we also have to be vigilant, obviously, and I think the chairman has said this. I certainly think that Commissioner McDowell is very interested in ensuring that fraud, waste, and abuse is reduced to an absolute minimum. As I said, regular audits are already being performed. I think they need to be. There's always been this penalty of perjury that, interestingly, I guess nobody has ever gone after, either at the state level or at the federal level. And then obviously all of these companies are subject to fines by the FCC or other oversight, as well as in some states, state AG and other appropriate oversight by state entities. There is also obviously strong on the front end oversight of the eligibility, which I believe is going to probably be even stronger through some of the industries coming together, the Lifeline LinkUp providers et al. So here we are at a time when unemployment in many states is far above the national average of 9.2. Most jobs require online applications. And many people basically are still seeing the really tough signs of the economic recession. I mean, Washington in many ways is insulated and is booming. I mean, even your real estate market really hasn't taken the hit. But if you all go out to towns and even cities across America, you'll see that Americans are really hurting. So that's why I just believe that Lifeline and Link Up is one of those important government subsidies that needs to be continued, certainly improved, and certainly reformed. But I think that it is emphatically the way that we can provide the link to these people, to our nation's communication systems, to ensure that nobody is left behind, and that indeed, as the Congress has intended since the 1934 Act, that all Americans should have access to our communications, and since the 94 Act, to advanced telecommunications services. I guess I wanted to say just a couple of other things, and that is that, Mike, I don't know, I think it was your 3% that you talked about, and so maybe you can talk a little bit more about the 3% growth. I didn't want to ask Randy to pay the gigantic fee to put up one slide, but this is the slide that I used to use all the time, and this is the growth in the high cost fund. And at that point in time, and so I'm dating myself, but those statistics were 100% growth year over year. And so that has been ingrained in my brain for a long time. One other statement that you said, and you used the word experimental. And in some ways, I think that is where the FCC should be heading, because I think it's going to take some experimentation and some pilot projects and some new ideas about how we do reach those last few million people, whether they're Jerry's numbers or they're the numbers that have been quoted by the FCC. So thanks, Randy.
Okay, Debbie, thank you very much. Now, for the reporters here and our transcriber, I want to just point out at the beginning of Commissioner Tate's remarks, she said ecosystem, not ecosystem, when she was talking about this issue that we're dealing with today. And also, thanks for bringing up the Lifeline thing. I just want to say briefly, I don't want to go on about it, but I myself, and you can go back and see what I've written for many, many years. I've always been supportive of the Lifeline Link Up programs, of course, properly administered, and they ought to be that. But it's always seemed to me, that type of safety net program made sense, and if done properly and with adequate support, in my view, it really, that's where a focus ought to be, that makes it easier than to deal with really reducing the subsidy support that is much less targeted and much more indiscriminate. And so to me, there's a link up between Lifeline and these other things in my mind, and for many years I've said that, because I see a role for universal service subsidies, but I really see a focus that ought to be really on, in my mind, that Lifeline program to a important extent. Now, the panelists are going to be interacting. I know Debbie's already thrown out a bit of a challenge here. For the moment, while I'm thinking of it, I want to have you join me in thanking Kathy Baker, our events coordinator, who does a lot of the arrangements for these programs. So if you'll do that, I appreciate it. Thank you. Kathy's over there, and just also at this time, I want to acknowledge Seth Cooper's over there. Seth, as many of you know, is a research fellow at the Free State Foundation, and Seth has been doing an awful lot of good work here for the past many months, which contribute greatly to the Free State Foundation. So Seth, we thank you for that as well. Okay, now with that, let's have some interaction among the panelists, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. But so Mike, we'll start off with you, because I did have in mind, and I think in the past I had done graphs or tables, things like Commissioner Tate, the one that she held up, and I don't know, I was never good at math, though, and that was not one of my subjects, but it did seem to me like the high cost fund was growing more than 3% a year. So just explain what you meant by that 3% number.
Sure. So if you look at it from, say, 2005 onward, in 2005 you had, the earlier part of that decade, 2003, 2004, 2005, you had a number of plans come into effect. You had calls and MAG and other things. That led to some access restructuring that may have led to the growth that you're talking about or thinking of in years past, earlier part of the decade. But since that access restructuring in 2005, 2006 or so, the high cost fund has been relatively stable. If you look at the high cost fund portion of the Universal Service Fund, and there's actually a chart in the FCC's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and I've got this committed to memory. I think it's figure 7 or something like that in the NPRM. But it's there's a chart that shows from 2006 to 2010 the relative growth in the high cost fund among different types of carriers, CETCs, non-rural, or price caps, and then rate of return carriers. And that showed overall a relatively stable fund, high cost fund during that period, the last 5-6 years.
Okay. Tom?
I think that that's for wireline carriers, the stability. We've had great growth in the amount of money going to wireless carriers from the high-cost fund. Now, this is really an abuse of the system, I think. As Debbie indicated there, she recalled a case where there were 14 carriers qualifying to provide, to receive universal service support for a given geographic area, and that's because probably a dozen of those were wireless carriers. The wireless carriers then received the support based on the cost of providing wireline service in the area. Of course, when you provide wireline service, you usually have one phone to the household. With wireless service, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 phones in the household, and you can get support, that level of support for each of those devices. Now, as you know, the purpose of universal service support was to provide a subsidy to high-cost voice, high-cost areas so that customers didn't have to pay huge amounts for voice service. But, of course, because wireless is basically priced on a nationwide basis, driven by the nationwide carriers, you don't have these high-cost areas for voice with wireless service. So the whole, it's a distortion of the purpose of the fund. It's obviously a gaming of the system. It doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective. But you saw the growth skyrocket in the last 5 years for wireless services.
Okay, Jerry?
Let me just follow up on that with a question, which is, if we have wireless service, a basic wireless plan available for $29.95 a month, or if we have satellite phone service, we're talking about voice. I went and looked online yesterday and found out if you take the cost of a satellite phone, amortize it over 12 months, and add the monthly fee, you can get a satellite phone for a cost of about $60 a month. Dividing the cost of the equipment by 12 and then throwing the monthly fee in. A question that we ought to ask and answer is, why would we ever pay a per-line subsidy greater than about $30 in an area where wireless is available, or greater than $60 in an area where only satellite is available? There may be reasons sometimes, because there are economies of scale, and you have companies that aren't receiving support for all lines, and they're just receiving support for lines in some areas, and so granted, there are some indivisibilities, and in some cases there may be good reasons. But I think it's a question worth asking. If we can simply buy somebody the service for $30 or $60 a month, why are we ever paying more than that in a subsidy?
Let's go to Mike and then Tom after that.
Yeah, just to be clear, I couldn't agree with you more, Tom, on the point about where the growth has come from. That was what I actually mentioned when I started with that 3% figure, was the rampant growth that was cited really has come from the identical support and multiple carriers receiving support in a single area. Also, Lifeline link-up has led to an increase over the last several years, and perhaps appropriately so. But that's also a source of where the increase has come from. So I think we agree. So then it comes back to, well, what problem am I trying to solve? If I'm trying to solve where's the growth coming from and how do I control it, let's isolate where that growth is, i.e. identical support, for example. Let's start there. Then beyond that, say, okay, I've taken care of that issue. Now let's target to what the next set of questions is, and that kind of gets into Jerry's point about where, what's an efficient support vehicle? Does it make sense to be, supporting so much per line or whatever it is? The one comment I'll make on that, and this has to do with often a debate that comes up about wireless and wires. Wireless needs wires. They're complementary services. The FCC has said as much. There's a large nationwide provider of cell phone service out there today who is putting out a huge marketing campaign giving away femtocell technology devices to customers. The reason they're doing that, I assume, is because it's cheaper for them to make sure that they can hop the data off onto the Wi-Fi connection to the house, that's a landline connection, and have it not go over their mobile data network. At the end of the day, it's far cheaper on a per megabit basis, I think, to carry traffic over the wireline network than over the wireless network because of some of the spectrum concerns. So it's not as simple to say, well, everybody should just get wireless. The two are complementary services. You need greater and greater backhaul to support a wireless network, and you're not going to have that out in rural America if the only place a wireline network serves is a cell tower.
Okay, well, let's keep, I had Tom and then James. After that, this is good because let's keep trying to hone in on where the biggest problems really in dollars and efficiency and so forth are, and then what the solutions are, and that'll be most useful. Tom.
Jerry raised a question about why pay for wireline networks. And in an age, as Debbie noted, when so many people are moving to wireless. And I think it is one of the fundamental questions. Obviously, if you accepted my framework about why we're doing this, one of the objectives is to manage the transition for the wireline carriers so they can go from the old world to the new world and do so while being financially stable. And so then the question becomes, what's the value of having the wireline carriers? And I think Mike provided part of the answer is that we think you need wireline carriers in order to be able to have good wireless service. I mean, if you don't have wireless goes from the, from the phone to the tower, but once it hits the tower, after that it's carried by wireline. So you need a decent wireline infrastructure. Do you need the last mile wireline infrastructure is the next question. I think that as you look to the future, I believe most of us at least conclude, and we're on both sides of the business, I think we conclude is that yes, consumers will use wireline infrastructure as more and more capacity is demanded, and for very high capacity things, including a lot of video, HD, 3D, and so on, they're going to be using wireline infrastructure, as well as major files, teleconferencing, healthcare monitoring, a lot of those things, that the wireline infrastructure is going to be more robust and more reliable, and it is also going to be more secure, potentially. Wireless is making progress